In the autumn of 1852, something happened in the sugarcane fields of St. Mary Parish that would challenge every understanding of human endurance and suffering. The events that unfolded on the Magnolia Grove plantation would become whispered legends among the enslaved population, spoken only in the darkest corners of quarters, when the moon offered no light and the overseer's footsteps had long since faded into silence. The plantation records, discovered during a routine inventory following the death of plantation owner Cornelius Beauregard in 1868, contained entries that defied explanation. Among bills of sale, harvest tallies, and punishment logs lay a series of increasingly frantic notes describing a man who seemed immune to physical pain. The handwriting, confirmed by historians to belong to Beauregard himself, grew more erratic with each entry. According to the plantation's meticulously kept records, a man identified only as Samuel arrived at Magnolia Grove in the spring of 1852. The bill of sale, dated March 15th of that year, listed him as 28 years of age, purchased from the estate of a deceased planter near Natchez, Mississippi. What made Samuel's acquisition noteworthy was not his price, which was considerably lower than expected for a man of his age and apparent health, but rather the notation scrawled in the margin of the document. The previous owner's estate manager had written in cramped script that Samuel required special consideration due to an unusual constitution. No further explanation was provided, and Beauregard, apparently viewing this as an opportunity to acquire skilled labor at reduced cost, completed the transaction without inquiry. Magnolia Grove sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres along the Atchafalaya River, its main house a testament to antebellum wealth built upon the labor of over 200 enslaved souls. The plantation specialized in sugar production, and the harvest season demanded brutal hours under the Louisiana sun. Beauregard prided himself on maintaining strict discipline, employing 3 overseers who enforced his rules with methodical precision. Samuel was assigned to the mill house where raw sugarcane was processed into crystallized sugar. The work was dangerous, requiring workers to feed stalks into crushing rollers while maintaining constant vigilance to avoid being caught in the machinery. The heat from the boiling vats created an atmosphere that veteran workers described as hellish, with temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees. For the first several weeks, Samuel's presence at Magnolia Grove went largely unnoticed. He performed his duties without complaint, spoke only when addressed, and maintained the demeanor expected of newly acquired property. The other workers noted his quiet nature, but attributed it to the natural wariness of someone adjusting to new surroundings and ownership. The first indication that something was different about Samuel came during the 3rd week of April. A new worker, recently purchased and unfamiliar with mill operations, accidentally knocked over a cauldron of boiling sugar syrup. The scalding liquid splashed across Samuel's left arm and shoulder, covering nearly half his torso. The other workers expected screams of agony, possibly unconsciousness from shock, certainly the kind of desperate writhing that accompanied such severe burns. Instead, Samuel calmly set down the cane stalks he had been feeding into the crusher and began removing his shirt to assess the damage. The silence in the mill house became profound, as everyone present witnessed something that contradicted their understanding of human response to injury. Samuel examined the angry red welts forming on his skin with the detached interest of someone observing a minor scrape. When the overseer arrived, drawn by reports of the accident, he found Samuel back at work, while the worker who had caused the spill remained doubled over in sympathetic horror. The burns that should have sent a man into shock were dismissed with a simple request for clean rags to prevent infection. The overseer's report to Beauregard that evening noted the incident, but focused primarily on the delay in production rather than Samuel's unusual reaction. Over the following days, As Samuel's burns began to heal, other workers started to pay closer attention to his responses to the inevitable minor injuries that plagued mill work. Cuts from broken glass, burns from hot metal, the constant abrasions from handling rough-hewn timber, all were met with the same calm acknowledgement. Samuel would clean his wounds, bandage them when necessary, and continue working without any indication of discomfort. The whispered conversations in the quarters began to take on an edge of unease. Some attributed Samuel's tolerance to previous conditioning, suggesting he had been subjected to such regular punishment that he had learned to hide his pain. Others proposed that he possessed some form of divine protection, though such suggestions were quickly discouraged as dangerous talk that could bring unwanted attention from the overseers. Beauregard himself began to take notice when his head overseer, a man named Thaddeus Morrison, reported that Samuel had continued working after sustaining what should have been a debilitating injury to his hand. A metal clamp had snapped closed, crushing 2 fingers with enough force to break bone. Samuel had simply pried the clamp open, assessed the damage to his mangled digits, and requested permission to bind them before resuming his duties. Morrison's report included his own examination of Samuel's hand, during which he had deliberately applied pressure to the obviously broken bones. Samuel's only response had been to ask if Morrison required him to demonstrate the continued functionality of his remaining fingers. The overseer, a man hardened by years of enforcing discipline through physical punishment, admitted to feeling genuinely disturbed by the encounter. The incident that would fundamentally change Samuel's status at Magnolia Grove occurred on a sultry evening in early June. A fight had broken out in the quarters between 2 workers over a gambling dispute. Such altercations were not uncommon, but this one had escalated beyond the usual pushing and shouting to actual violence. When Morrison arrived to restore order, one man was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, while the other continued to kick him with vicious intensity. Morrison's standard response to such situations was immediate and severe punishment for all involved parties. He ordered both men to be brought to the whipping post the following morning, with additional punishment for the aggressor. Samuel, who had been sitting quietly nearby when the fight erupted, was included in the group to be disciplined for failing to prevent or report the altercation. The whipping post stood in full view of the quarters, positioned deliberately to ensure that all residents could witness the consequences of disobedience. Morrison's practice was to administer punishment in ascending order of severity, beginning with minor offenders and building to the primary transgressor. Samuel was scheduled to receive 10 lashes for his failure to intervene, a relatively moderate punishment that typically served more as humiliation than genuine physical torment. When Samuel was secured to the post, Morrison raised the leather whip with practiced efficiency. The first strike landed across Samuel's shoulders with a sharp crack that echoed across the courtyard. The gathered crowd expected to see Samuel's body tense with pain, to hear at least a grunt of discomfort. Instead, he remained perfectly still, as if the blow had been delivered to someone else entirely. Morrison, assuming he had not struck with sufficient force, applied the second lash with increased vigor. The leather cut through Samuel's shirt and opened a gash along his shoulder blade. Still no reaction. By the 5th strike, Morrison was putting his full strength behind each blow, and Samuel's back was crisscrossed with bleeding welts. Yet the man remained as motionless and silent as when he had first been tied to the post. The gathered crowd began to murmur among themselves. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers, while others backed away as if witnessing something unnatural. Morrison, now sweating heavily from exertion and growing frustration, completed the full 10 lashes with increasingly frantic energy. When Samuel was released from the post, he simply asked if he was dismissed to return to his duties. Word of the whipping spread beyond the plantation within days. Neighboring planters, some skeptical and others curious, began making excuses to visit Magnolia Grove. Beauregard, initially embarrassed by what he viewed as Morrison's failure to properly administer punishment, soon recognized that Samuel's unusual condition might be turned to his advantage. The demonstration became a regular feature of Beauregard's entertainment for visitors. Samuel would be subjected to various forms of physical punishment while guests observed his complete lack of response. Whippings, brandings, even deliberate cuts with knives all failed to produce any indication of pain or distress. Beauregard began charging admission for these exhibitions, turning Samuel's condition into a source of additional income. A physician from New Orleans, Dr. Henri Thibodeau, examined Samuel in late June at Beauregard's invitation. Dr. Thibodeau's written report, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, documented a series of tests designed to determine whether Samuel was simply exceptional at hiding pain or genuinely incapable of feeling it. The doctor applied heated implements to Samuel's skin, inserted needles into his flesh, and even made small incisions to observe his reactions. Dr. Thibodeau concluded that Samuel appeared to possess a genuine inability to experience physical pain. The physician noted that while Samuel could feel touch and pressure, he showed no physiological responses typically associated with painful stimuli. His pulse remained steady during procedures that should have caused significant distress, and his breathing never became labored or irregular. The doctor's report included speculation about possible medical explanations for Samuel's condition, referencing European medical texts that described rare cases of congenital insensitivity to pain. However, Dr. Thibodeau also noted several aspects of Samuel's condition that did not align with documented medical phenomena, particularly Samuel's apparent awareness of when he should be experiencing pain and his ability to assess and treat his own injuries. As summer progressed into fall, Samuel's reputation spread throughout the sugar-growing regions of Louisiana. Planters traveled from as far as Baton Rouge and Lafayette to witness demonstrations of his imperviousness to punishment. Beauregard expanded these exhibitions, constructing a small amphitheater behind the main house where spectators could observe in comfort, while Samuel endured increasingly elaborate forms of torture. The enslaved population at Magnolia Grove watched these proceedings with growing horror and fascination. Some began to view Samuel as a form of divine intervention, a sign that their suffering was acknowledged by higher powers. Others worried that his presence brought unwanted attention to the plantation and feared that their own punishments might become more severe as overseers attempted to prove their effectiveness. Samuel himself remained enigmatic throughout this period. He spoke little, worked efficiently, and showed no indication that he was aware of the spectacle he had become. When questioned directly about his condition by visitors or plantation staff, he would simply state that pain was not something that troubled him and that he preferred to focus on completing his assigned tasks. The first indication that Samuel's condition might have limits came in October, during what was intended to be the most elaborate demonstration yet staged. A group of planters from across the region had gathered for Beauregard's annual harvest celebration, and the host had promised them an unprecedented display of Samuel's abilities. The demonstration began with the usual whipping, followed by the application of heated brands to various parts of Samuel's body. As the assembled crowd watched in fascination and horror, Morrison escalated to more extreme measures. A red-hot poker was pressed against Samuel's chest, leaving a smoking brand that filled the air with the acrid smell of burning flesh. For the first time since his arrival at Magnolia Grove, Samuel's composure flickered. It was barely perceptible, perhaps only a slight tightening around his eyes or a moment of hesitation before resuming his usual calm demeanor. But several observers noticed the change, and word quickly spread that the invincible man might not be as immune to suffering as previously believed. Beauregard, either not noticing or choosing to ignore this subtle change, pushed the demonstration further. He ordered Morrison to prepare a length of chain that had been heated in the blacksmith's forge until it glowed white hot. The plan was to drape this chain across Samuel's shoulders, creating a punishment so severe that few men would survive it, much less endure it without reaction. As Morrison approached with the glowing chain, Samuel spoke for the first time during any demonstration. His voice was quiet but clear enough to be heard by everyone present. He asked Morrison to wait a moment and then turned to address Beauregard directly. What Samuel said that day became the subject of intense debate among those present. Some claimed he made a simple request to postpone the demonstration until the following day, citing fatigue from the harvest work. Others insisted he spoke in a language none of them recognized, possibly African in origin. A few witnesses maintained that Samuel's words were in perfectly clear English, but contained such profound blasphemy that they could not be repeated in polite company. Whatever Samuel actually said, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison, a man known for his unflinching brutality, dropped the heated chain and stepped backward, as if physically pushed. Beauregard turned pale and began shouting orders for the demonstration to end immediately. The gathered spectators, who had been eagerly anticipating the climax of the evening's entertainment, found themselves filing out in uncomfortable silence. The plantation records for the following weeks contain increasingly erratic entries in Beauregard's handwriting. References to Samuel become sparse and cryptic, often consisting of single-word notations like quiet or watching with no additional context. The meticulous documentation of punishments and work assignments that had characterized the plantation's record-keeping gave way to fragmented observations and incomplete sentences. Morrison's daily reports, previously detailed accounts of productivity and discipline, became equally sparse. His final report, dated November 12th, consisted of a single line stating that Samuel had been assigned to work alone in the furthest cane fields and should not be disturbed. No explanation was provided for this dramatic change in Samuel's duties, particularly during the crucial harvest period, when every available worker was needed in the mill. Workers in the quarters began to report strange occurrences during this period. Tools would be found arranged in patterns that no one could explain, always in areas where Samuel had been working. The sounds of singing could be heard from the distant fields at night, though Samuel had never been known to sing, and the melodies were unlike anything familiar to the other enslaved workers. More disturbing were the reports of Samuel's behavior during the brief periods when he returned to the quarters for meals or supplies. He would sit silently, staring at specific individuals with an intensity that made them deeply uncomfortable. When approached or spoken to, he would respond appropriately, but in a monotone voice that seemed to come from somewhere distant. The end came suddenly on the morning of November 23rd. Morrison's assistant, a young man named Jefferson Hayes, was sent to check on Samuel's progress in the remote field where he had been working. Hayes found the field empty, except for a neat pile of Samuel's clothing and tools placed at the exact center of the planted area. A search of the surrounding countryside yielded no trace of Samuel. The Atchafalaya River, swollen with recent rains, was dragged without result. Tracker dogs brought in from neighboring plantations showed no interest in following any scent trail, as if Samuel had simply vanished without leaving any physical trace of his presence. Beauregard's response to Samuel's disappearance was swift and decisive. Within days, he had sold Magnolia Grove and departed Louisiana for parts unknown. The plantation records were abandoned in the main house, where they remained untouched until the property was inventoried following Beauregard's death 16 years later. The new owners of the property, a family named the Broussards, found the main house in a state of decay that seemed inconsistent with the relatively short period it had been abandoned. The walls were stained with moisture damage, and several rooms had developed extensive mold growth, despite the dry climate that had prevailed during the plantation's vacancy. More puzzling were the modifications that had been made to the interior of the house. Mirrors had been covered with black cloth, religious symbols had been carved into door frames, and salt had been spread across thresholds. The master bedroom contained a collection of religious texts from various denominations. Many opened to passages dealing with spiritual protection and divine intervention. The quarters where the enslaved workers had lived were in even worse condition. Several buildings had been partially demolished, as if someone had been searching for something hidden within the walls. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area, but always arranged in the same strange patterns that workers had reported seeing in the fields during Samuel's final weeks at the plantation. Local residents, both black and white, avoided the abandoned plantation entirely. Stories circulated about lights visible in the windows of the empty buildings and sounds of machinery operating despite the absence of any workers. A few brave individuals who ventured onto the property reported finding fresh tool marks on trees and fence posts, as if someone continued to maintain the grounds despite its obvious abandonment. The Broussards attempted to restore the plantation to working condition, but their efforts were hampered by the difficulty of finding workers willing to remain on the property overnight. Even during daylight hours, laborers reported feeling constantly observed, though no source for this sensation could be identified. A local minister, Reverend Gabriel Fontenot, was asked to bless the property before the Broussards took up residence. His account of that visit, preserved in the records of the St. Mary Parish Diocese, described an overwhelming sense of oppression that seemed to emanate from the very soil of the plantation. Reverend Fontenot noted that the area where Samuel had been known to work alone showed signs of recent cultivation, despite having been abandoned for months. The furrows were perfectly straight and evenly spaced, suggesting the work of someone with exceptional skill and patience. More disturbing was the complete absence of any plant or animal life in this section of the field, as if the earth itself had been rendered sterile. The minister's blessing apparently had little effect. Within a month of taking residence, the Broussards began experiencing the same phenomena that had discouraged potential workers. Unexplained sounds in the night, the sensation of being watched, and strange arrangements of household objects that appeared without explanation. Mrs. Celeste Broussard documented these occurrences in a series of letters to her sister in New Orleans. The letters, discovered in an attic trunk during renovations in 1903, described a gradual escalation from minor annoyances to genuinely frightening experiences. The final letter in the collection, dated March 15, 1854, described Mrs. Broussard's encounter with a figure she initially believed to be a trespasser. She had awakened in the early hours of the morning to find someone standing in her bedroom, motionless and silent, despite her screams. When her husband arrived with a lamp, they found the room empty except for a set of wet footprints leading from the window to the foot of their bed. The Broussards abandoned the plantation the following day, joining the ranks of those who found the property uninhabitable despite its obvious potential for profit. The plantation remained vacant until 1859, when it was purchased by a land speculator who divided the acreage into smaller parcels for sale to individual farmers. Most of these smaller farms prospered, but the central area of the original plantation, including the main house and the field where Samuel had last been seen, remained unsold. Potential buyers would express initial interest, but invariably withdraw their offers after visiting the property. Real estate agents reported that clients would become increasingly uncomfortable during tours, often cutting their visits short without explanation. The outbreak of the Civil War effectively ended any prospect of developing the abandoned section of the plantation. Federal forces used the empty buildings as a temporary depot during their occupation of the Atchafalaya region, but their stay was brief. Military reports indicated that the facility was unsuitable for extended use due to atmospheric conditions detrimental to troop morale. After the war, efforts to locate former enslaved workers from Magnolia Grove proved largely unsuccessful. Many had scattered throughout Louisiana and beyond during the chaos of Reconstruction, and those who could be found were reluctant to discuss their experiences at the plantation. The few who would speak of Samuel described him in terms that suggested they viewed him as something more or less than human. One former worker, identified in Freedmen's Bureau records only as Uncle Tom, provided the most detailed account of Samuel's final weeks at the plantation. According to Uncle Tom, Samuel had begun speaking to people who were not visible to others, holding lengthy conversations with empty air while working alone in the fields. Uncle Tom also described changes in Samuel's physical appearance during this period. While Samuel had never shown signs of aging or wear, despite the brutal conditions of plantation life, he began to seem somehow diminished. His clothes hung looser on his frame, though he showed no signs of illness or malnutrition. His movements became more deliberate, as if each action required conscious effort rather than natural reflex. Most disturbing to Uncle Tom was Samuel's apparent awareness of events happening elsewhere on the plantation without any possible means of knowing about them. Samuel would reference conversations he could not have overheard and demonstrate knowledge of activities taking place in distant buildings. When questioned about these abilities, Samuel would simply state that walls and distance meant little to those who knew how to listen properly. The last person known to have spoken with Samuel was an elderly woman named Mama Celia, who served as an informal spiritual advisor to the enslaved community. Her account, preserved in an oral history project conducted by Tulane University in 1928, suggested that Samuel had sought her guidance in the days before his disappearance. According to Mama Celia, Samuel had asked her about methods of going home when home no longer existed in any physical sense. He spoke of feeling disconnected from the world around him, as if he were viewing everything through thick glass or murky water. The pain he could not feel physically had been replaced by an emotional numbness that isolated him from human connection. Mama Celia's advice, she recalled, had been to seek his ancestors through prayer and meditation. Samuel had listened carefully to her guidance, but expressed doubt about whether the ancestors would welcome someone who had been changed as much as he had been. Their final conversation ended with Samuel asking Mama Celia to remember him as he had been when he first arrived at the plantation, before he became a spectacle for the entertainment of others. In the decades following the Civil War, the abandoned section of the former Magnolia Grove plantation became a local landmark of sorts. Children from the surrounding farms would dare each other to approach the empty main house, though few were brave enough to actually enter the building. Those who did venture inside reported finding rooms that seemed to have been recently occupied, despite the obvious years of abandonment. The field where Samuel had last been seen working developed a reputation among local farmers for its unusual properties. Crops planted in the surrounding areas would grow normally up to the boundary of this field, then simply stop as if encountering an invisible barrier. The soil itself showed no obvious signs of contamination or depletion, but nothing would take root in the earth where Samuel had once labored alone. A team of agricultural investigators from Louisiana State University examined the field in 1897 as part of a broader study of soil conditions in the Atchafalaya region. Their findings, published in the Journal of Southern Agriculture, noted significant anomalies in the chemical composition of the soil, but could offer no scientific explanation for the complete absence of microbial life. The investigators also documented the presence of furrows and planting rows that appeared to be maintained despite the absence of any agricultural activity in the area for over 40 years. These furrows followed patterns that did not correspond to any known farming techniques and seemed to serve no practical purpose for crop cultivation. Local residents who observed the university team's work reported that the investigators left the site earlier than planned and appeared visibly disturbed by their findings. Requests for follow-up studies were quietly denied, and the university's published report omitted several observations that had been included in preliminary field notes. As the 19th century drew to a close, stories about the abandoned plantation and its mysterious former worker had become part of local folklore. Parents used tales of Samuel to encourage obedience in their children, warning that those who failed to properly feel the consequences of their actions might end up like the man who felt no pain, but lost his connection to the world of the living. The main house finally collapsed during a hurricane in 1906, but the foundation remained visible among the overgrown vegetation. Visitors to the site reported that the ruins seemed to retain an unnatural chill even during the hottest days of summer, and that sounds of working machinery could sometimes be heard coming from beneath the collapsed structure. The mystery of Samuel's disappearance was never officially solved, though theories abounded throughout the region. Some believed he had escaped to the north, though his unusual condition would have made him easy to identify and recapture. Others suggested he had drowned in the Atchafalaya River, his body carried away by the current to some distant resting place. A more disturbing theory, whispered among the descendants of those who had known Samuel, suggested that he had not disappeared at all, but had simply returned to whatever place or state of being he had come from. According to this interpretation, Samuel's immunity to pain had been a sign that he was not entirely human, and his time at Magnolia Grove had been a temporary sojourn rather than a permanent condition. The most detailed investigation into Samuel's fate was conducted by a historian named Professor Marcus Dufresne in 1932. Professor Dufresne, working under a grant from the Louisiana Historical Society, spent several years collecting testimonies from elderly residents who remembered the events at Magnolia Grove or had heard first-hand accounts from their parents and grandparents. Professor Dufresne's research uncovered additional documents that had been overlooked by previous investigators. Among these was a letter written by Dr. Henri Thibodeau to a colleague in Paris, describing his examination of Samuel in much greater detail than his published report had revealed. The letter suggested that Dr. Thibodeau had become convinced that Samuel's condition was not medical in nature, but represented something that fell outside the boundaries of scientific understanding. The letter also mentioned that Dr. Thibodeau had attempted to locate Samuel after his disappearance, traveling to various plantations throughout Louisiana in search of anyone matching his description. These efforts had proven fruitless, leading Dr. Thibodeau to conclude that Samuel had either died or somehow managed to conceal his distinctive condition from further observation. Professor Dufresne's most significant discovery was a collection of sketches and notes found in the personal effects of Morrison, the overseer who had administered Samuel's punishments. These documents, apparently hidden away and forgotten after Morrison's death in 1871, provided a more intimate perspective on the events at Magnolia Grove. Morrison's notes revealed a growing obsession with understanding Samuel's condition and an increasing doubt about his own role in exploiting it. The overseer had begun to question whether the punishments he administered actually affected Samuel in ways that were not immediately visible, wondering if the absence of apparent pain might mask deeper forms of suffering. The sketches showed Morrison's attempts to document the patterns in which Samuel arranged tools and other objects. These patterns were complex and geometric, resembling mathematical formulations more than random arrangements. Morrison had apparently spent considerable time trying to decode their meaning, filling pages with calculations and diagrams that attempted to map some underlying logic. Morrison's final entry in this secret record was dated the day before Samuel's disappearance. The writing was increasingly erratic, suggesting either illness or extreme agitation. The entry described Morrison's growing conviction that Samuel was somehow aware of the overseer's private observations and was deliberately creating increasingly complex patterns as a form of communication or warning. The entry ended with Morrison's resolution to confront Samuel directly about the patterns and demand an explanation for their meaning. This confrontation, if it actually took place, occurred during the night before Samuel vanished, suggesting it might have been the catalyst for his disappearance. Professor Dufresne's investigation concluded with his attempt to locate the exact spot where Samuel had last been seen. Using Morrison's sketches and testimonies from former plantation workers, he identified the area where Samuel's clothing and tools had been found. The professor's survey of the site revealed that the ground showed signs of having been systematically disturbed, as if someone had been conducting an archaeological excavation. More puzzling was the presence of what appeared to be a foundation or platform buried several feet below the surface. The structure was made of stones that were not native to the immediate area and were arranged in a pattern that resembled the geometric designs Morrison had documented in his sketches. Professor Dufresne's request to conduct a full archaeological excavation of the site was denied by the current landowner, who cited concerns about disturbing what might be a burial ground. Subsequent attempts by other researchers to gain access to the property have been similarly unsuccessful, leaving the nature of the buried structure undetermined. The last documented sighting of someone resembling Samuel occurred in 1948, nearly a century after his disappearance from Magnolia Grove. A construction crew working on improvements to a rural road near the former plantation reported encountering a man who matched Samuel's description, working alone in a field that had been abandoned for decades. The crew foreman, a man named Robert Trosclair, approached the figure to inquire about his presence on private property. According to Trosclair's account, the man turned to face him but seemed to look through rather than at him, as if Trosclair were not entirely present. When asked to identify himself, the figure simply stated that he was finishing work that had been left undone. Trosclair reported that the man showed signs of having been severely burned over much of his body, with scars and discolored skin that should have been debilitatingly painful. Yet the figure moved with fluid grace and showed no indication of discomfort as he continued his inexplicable labor in the empty field. When Trosclair returned with other crew members to investigate further, they found the field empty except for freshly turned soil arranged in the familiar geometric patterns that had characterized Samuel's work at Magnolia Grove. No footprints or other signs of recent human presence could be detected, despite the obviously recent disturbance of the earth. The incident was reported to local authorities, who conducted a brief investigation but found no evidence of trespassing or unusual activity. The case was closed without explanation, joining the long list of unexplained occurrences associated with the former Magnolia Grove plantation. Today, the area where the plantation once stood is largely forgotten except by local historians and the occasional curious researcher. The fields have been reclaimed by forest, and few visible traces remain of the buildings that once housed hundreds of enslaved workers and witnessed Samuel's extraordinary demonstrations of pain tolerance. Yet residents of St. Mary Parish still speak in hushed tones about the man who felt no pain, and children are still warned against venturing too close to the marshy ground where the old plantation boundaries can still be discerned. On certain nights, when the mist rises from the Atchafalaya River and sound carries farther than it should, some claim to hear the rhythmic sounds of solitary labor echoing across the empty fields. The story of Samuel raises questions that extend beyond the boundaries of historical investigation into realms where documentation fails and witness testimony becomes the only guide to understanding. Whether his condition represented a rare medical phenomenon, a form of spiritual intervention, or something else entirely, remains a matter of speculation among those who study the darker chapters of Louisiana's past. What seems certain is that Samuel's brief presence at Magnolia Grove left an indelible mark on everyone who encountered him, from the enslaved workers who saw him as either blessed or cursed, to the white plantation owners who exploited his condition for profit and entertainment. His disappearance solved nothing and explained less, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that some aspects of human experience cannot be properly categorized or understood. The records that survive from this period paint a picture of a man caught between worlds, neither fully present in the physical realm that surrounded him, nor entirely absent from it. His immunity to pain, rather than being a gift, appears to have been a form of isolation that separated him from the shared experience of suffering that connected other human beings to one another and to their own mortality. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samuel's story is not his mysterious disappearance or his inexplicable condition, but the ease with which his suffering, however different from conventional pain, was transformed into entertainment for those who viewed him as something less than human. The demonstrations at Magnolia Grove revealed as much about the observers as they did about Samuel himself, exposing the depths of cruelty that human beings are capable of inflicting when they convince themselves that their victims exist outside the boundaries of normal moral consideration. In the end, Samuel remains an enigma wrapped in the larger tragedy of American slavery, a reminder that even the most thoroughly documented historical periods contain mysteries that resist explanation. His story serves as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit, and simultaneously as a warning about the consequences of treating fellow human beings as objects for exploitation rather than as individuals deserving of dignity and compassion. The fields where Samuel once labored continue to resist cultivation, as if the earth itself remembers the presence of someone who challenged every assumption about the relationship between suffering and existence. Whether this resistance represents some form of environmental contamination, spiritual manifestation, or simply the intersection of local folklore with psychological expectation, it ensures that Samuel's memory persists in the landscape itself. Those who study the historical records of Magnolia Grove are left to wonder whether Samuel ever found the home he sought in his conversations with Mama Celia, or whether he continues to wander the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, forever completing work that can never be finished. The geometric patterns he created with such precision suggest a mind grappling with concepts that existed beyond the immediate reality of plantation life, perhaps seeking to map pathways between different states of being. The most recent investigation into Samuel's fate was conducted in 1963 by a team of researchers from Tulane University's Department of Anthropology. Led by Professor Margaret Hebert, the team attempted to apply modern archaeological techniques to uncover evidence of Samuel's final days at the plantation. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team detected the presence of what appeared to be a large underground chamber beneath the field where Samuel had last been working. The chamber was roughly rectangular, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, and appeared to be lined with the same non-native stones that Professor Dufresne had discovered decades earlier. The team's request to excavate the chamber was initially approved by the property owner, but permission was revoked following a series of equipment failures and unexplained accidents that plagued the early stages of the investigation. 2 graduate students working on the project reported experiencing severe headaches and disorientation, when working directly above the suspected chamber location. Professor Hebert's final report, filed with the university in December of 1963, recommended that the site be left undisturbed. The report cited concerns about soil stability and potential contamination, but colleagues noted that Professor Hebert seemed deeply troubled by the experience and retired from active research shortly afterward. The chamber remains unexcavated to this day. Modern property owners have consistently refused requests for further investigation, and local authorities have shown little interest in pursuing the matter. The area is now marked with warning signs, citing environmental hazards, effectively discouraging casual visitors while providing no specific explanation for the danger. In 1968, exactly 116 years after Samuel's disappearance, the last surviving person with direct knowledge of the events at Magnolia Grove passed away. Marie Boudreau, great-granddaughter of one of the plantation's former enslaved workers, had preserved oral traditions passed down through 3 generations of her family. Before her death, Marie Boudreau provided a final testimony to local historian Dr. James Landry. According to her account, Samuel had not disappeared, but had chosen to return to what her ancestors called the quiet place, a realm that existed alongside the physical world but remained invisible to most human perception. Marie Boudreau described Samuel as a guardian figure who continued to watch over those who suffered without the power to defend themselves. She claimed that on certain nights, particularly during times of great injustice or cruelty, Samuel could still be seen walking the boundaries of the old plantation, ensuring that the suffering of the past was not forgotten and would not be repeated. Her testimony included specific instructions for those who might encounter Samuel's presence. They should acknowledge his sacrifice with silence and respect, never attempt to photograph or document him, and always remember that some forms of protection come at costs that cannot be measured in conventional terms. Dr. Landry's attempts to verify Marie Boudreau's claims led him to discover a pattern of unexplained events throughout St. Mary Parish that seemed to correlate with instances of abuse or exploitation. In several documented cases, individuals who had harmed others had experienced sudden and inexplicable accidents or illnesses that left them permanently changed but not seriously injured. These incidents shared certain characteristics. The victims were always people in positions of power who had used that power to cause suffering to others. The consequences always matched the nature of their crimes in symbolic ways, and the affected individuals invariably reported sensing the presence of someone watching them in the moments before their misfortune struck. Dr. Landry's investigation was cut short when he suffered a severe heart attack while researching in the Louisiana State Archives. He survived, but was left with permanent memory problems that made it impossible for him to continue his work. His research notes, found scattered and partially destroyed in his office, suggested that he had been close to uncovering connections between Samuel's story and similar cases throughout the American South. The archives containing Dr. Landry's research were damaged in a fire in 1971, destroying most of the documentation he had compiled. The few surviving fragments hint at a larger pattern of individuals with unusual conditions appearing at various plantations and mills throughout the region during the antebellum period, always during times of particular brutality. Today, the story of Samuel is remembered primarily through local folklore and the occasional academic paper that treats it as an interesting example of slave narratives and their evolution over time. Most scholars approach the account as a form of resistance literature, viewing Samuel's immunity to pain as a metaphorical expression of spiritual strength rather than a literal phenomenon. Yet among the descendants of those who lived through the era of slavery, Samuel's story maintains a different significance. He is remembered not as a symbol or metaphor, but as a real person whose sacrifice opened pathways between the world of the living and the realm of justice that exists beyond human law. The field where Samuel last worked remains empty. The geometric patterns he created continue to appear in the soil each spring, as if the earth itself remembers the precise mathematics of his labor. Local farmers have learned to plant around these areas, accepting the loss of productive land as a small price for avoiding whatever force maintains those ancient furrows. On quiet nights, when the mist rises from the Atchafalaya River and the boundary between past and present grows thin, residents of St. Mary Parish sometimes report seeing a solitary figure moving through the abandoned fields. The figure appears to be working, though no tools are visible and no sound carries across the distance. Those who have witnessed this apparition describe a man whose movements suggest both infinite patience and profound sorrow, as if he carries the weight of all the suffering that has passed through this place. He works alone in the darkness, maintaining patterns that serve purposes beyond human understanding, completing tasks that began in slavery and continue in freedom. Whether Samuel found the peace he sought in his conversations with Mama Celia, or whether he remains bound to the scene of his exploitation by chains stronger than those forged by human hands, is a question that may never be answered. His story stands as testimony to the endurance of the human spirit and the terrible costs of treating fellow human beings as objects rather than souls. The terror of Louisiana lies not in supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries, but in the recognition that the capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and transcendent courage exists within ordinary human hearts. Samuel's legacy reminds us that pain, whether physical or emotional, cannot be escaped through immunity or indifference, but must be acknowledged, shared, and ultimately transformed through the recognition of our common humanity. In the end, perhaps Samuel achieved what no amount of whipping or burning could accomplish. He became truly free, not from pain, but from the limitation that pain can only destroy rather than redeem. His story echoes across the generations as a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are those who find ways to transform suffering into protection for others. The geometric patterns in the abandoned field continue to appear each spring, precise and purposeful as mathematical equations written in the earth itself. They serve as Samuel's final message, that some truths transcend the boundaries of life and death, and that the work of justice once begun continues until all accounts are balanced and all debts are paid.